So I just wanted to start off. Everyone in this room is probably very well aware of the state of the health of Australian men, but I just wanted to bring to your attention a couple of key statistics related to work in particular in the southwestern Sydney region. In Australia, just under half of men have experienced a mental disorder, and we know that suicide is a leading cause of death in men in Australia, and it's alarming the rates that we're seeing suicide deaths still occurring. Suicide's more than 3 times as common in men in comparison to women, and we know in particular in young men, rates are very high. In southwestern Sydney, we see the second highest number of suicide deaths in comparison to other areas in Sydney. And despite all of this, we know that around 72% of men don't actually seek help for mental ill health. So if they are struggling with their mental health, a lot of men will delay help seeking. And that's for a number of really complex reasons. For some men, they don't know where to turn. For some men, there's a very deep stigma associated with mental health and with actually reaching out for support and seeking help. And we're going to be talking about a little bit of this tonight as well. But the reasons are very complex and they vary from person to person. What evidence also tells us is even though men, and there is some recent evidence to suggest that men are starting to engage more with mental health support services and with health services in general, in comparison to women, we know that men tend to engage less frequently with health services. And often when they do engage, it's at a more progressed state of illness or a particular condition. And consultations also tend to be shorter. So if men are going along to the GP, a lot of them will sort of go in and get what they need and come out without having a kind of deep conversation. In the work that we've done as well, we've found that a lot of men, particularly in middle-aged men, a lot of the work I do is in men aged sort of mid-30s up to mid-60s, is that a lot of them don't actually have a regular GP. So if something comes up for them in terms of their mental health or their physical health, a lot of them don't really kind of think, I'm going to go and have a chat with my GP about this, because they don't actually have someone regular that they can go to who knows their history and who they feel comfortable having a conversation with. And that's definitely something that needs to change. In the southwestern Sydney region, the Southwestern Sydney Primary Health Network and Local Health District developed a regional mental health and suicide prevention plan, which is really promising. And most regions across Australia are coming up with regional plans that are designed to be tailored to the needs of the people living in their regions. But what this identified was an urgent need for integrated service delivery and planning. And what the PHN and the LHD did really well, and they do this very well with a lot of the work they do, is this was all developed in collaboration, very close collaboration with stakeholders from across the region. And these were people who were just community members, people who were working in mental health services and community organisations who came together to provide advice on what needed to be done in the region. And there were 7 key priority areas for mental health and suicide prevention that were developed, just as a bit of background. And I think the work that Mentoring Men are doing fits very well into a couple of these very key areas. And for me, I think one of the big things is the final point here, empowering and supporting individuals and communities. And this was something that came out very strongly in the work that we did around the evaluation of the Mentoring Men program, was that men did feel quite empowered to actually seek help or to, reach out and give back to their community through, mentorship. So that's I think a really strong, a huge strength of the Mentoring Men program. I also know that there is a very strong focus on engaging men from a diverse range of backgrounds too, which fits in very well with this, this prevention plan. So as part of this plan, the Southwestern Sydney Primary Health Network were able to secure some funding to roll out a grant scheme that supported proactive approaches to men's suicide prevention. And this is a really interesting concept because I think suicide prevention, and Simon and I actually had a conversation. I just saw Simon popped up just as I was mentioning that. We had a conversation the other day, and this also came out in some of the interviews we did with the wonderful staff at Mentoring Men and across the organisations that we evaluated. was this conversation around how we actually measure suicide prevention, because it is so hard, and there are so many amazing programs that go a long way in terms of actually providing support and help that men need, so that if they do get to the point where they do find themselves in crisis, they then have the tools and the networks around them that can help to support them through that particular point in time. So this is a really tricky thing to measure. And so we were tasked with the very large activity of actually evaluating 4 very different suicide prevention approaches and programs that were developed to support men's mental health in southwestern Sydney. And Mentoring Men was one of those programs that was part of the overall evaluation and funded under this large grant scheme in the southwest Sydney region. So this was really an opportunity for Mentoring Men to be rolled out in another region where it's already been shown to be so successful. And I'm not sure if anyone online today is from the southwestern Sydney region, but there's a huge need, as I just mentioned before, for more integrated approaches, but also some of those less traditional approaches to supporting men's mental health in the region, which I think Mentoring Men does very well. So we took a mixed methods approach. We did some survey work, but what I'm going to focus on tonight, because this is where the real impact comes through, is the qualitative phase of the evaluation. So this evaluation involved a series of interviews and focus groups, and we wanted to get a really broad perspective on the impact of the program. So we spoke with program participants, so mentors and mentees, but we also spoke with what we called very broadly service delivery providers. So we had program coordinators, people who ran training. We spoke with a range of different people to understand the impact of what was actually happening in these mentoring relationships. And really what we wanted to focus on were the elements of the program that worked really well and could be replicated in other settings, but also could be replicated in other population groups, potentially for the Mentoring Men program. The relevance of the contents, we wanted to understand a little bit more about the impact of the mentor training that's done, but also some of the other activities that I know everyone's so involved with, like these open forums. But we also were really interested in general perceptions of mental health and how this program can help to shift those. We were also looking at the perceived success of the program from a program coordinator perspective, and also just looking at organisational capacity to roll out the program as well, because anyone connected to this space knows men's health is not well funded in Australia. That's something that we are all, I think, trying to change. And the more evidence we have about the impact of programs like this, hopefully the more we can really shift that dial and get governments to really buy in and actually fund programs long term and well, so that the impact can be sustained. So for our qualitative evaluation, we conducted 12 interviews and 2 focus groups. We had 25 participants in total. So overall, we had 14 mentors and 6 mentees. So you can see the mentors were more represented than the mentees were, and that's a conversation that I know the Mentoring Men team internally is having at the moment. We also spoke with 4 wonderful program coordinators, which included people who were responsible for training and also people who were responsible for pairing and just kind of making sure that everything ran smoothly day to day. And we also had a community stakeholder involved who was from the Arabic community and also acted as a translator in one of our focus groups with Arabic men, which was a fantastic insight just into especially some of the complexities around discussing mental health when there is such a stigma in certain population groups and certain cultural groups as well. So what I'm now going to talk about is a couple of the key themes that came out of these interviews and focus groups. So what we do when we collect this qualitative data is we record all of the interviews and the focus groups so that we can then have those transcribed, and then we thematically analyse that data. So all of the interviews and focus groups were conducted by a wonderful qualitative researcher who has a background in health psychology and has done extensive work with men, but also looking at mental health in particular. So the themes that came out of this overall qualitative phase of the evaluation, the first was looking at traditional masculinity and stigma. And I think this is something that is a very big part of the conversation on men's mental health in Australia, and still probably something that we need to pay more attention to breaking down. The second was the magic of mentoring. So really what it meant to be a mentor, the impact that mentoring could have both on mentors and mentees. The importance of creating safe spaces and sharing stories. And this was something I think that Mentoring Men does very, very well. And I will speak to the power of this, but just touching on this very briefly, I think that sharing stories and sharing your own vulnerabilities is such a powerful way to try and encourage other men to open up as well. And then finally, there was an overarching theme that was looking at the strengths of the program and potential improvements for the future. So I'm now going to just touch on these, and I've got some quotes here, and I'll leave these here so that you can have a look, but I have bolded a couple of key parts of these different quotes just to draw your attention. The first one here I think is really important, and I think this is something that came up very commonly across all of the programs that we were evaluating as well. In Australia, there's this prevailing idea that showing emotions as a man can be a sign of weakness. And I think especially growing up, a lot of men were probably told that it's weak to cry and you don't show your emotions. And I mean, I know just sharing quite personally, I lost my dad actually 15 years ago, just recently, to cancer. And I was only 20 at the time. So it was a huge thing for me. I've got 5 brothers and 2 younger brothers who really struggled with losing their dad at such a young age. They were both still in high school. And, you know, I look at the impact that has had on all of our lives, but in particular my brothers. And my dad was probably very much like a lot of Australian men, where he was brought up the same way, not to really show emotions, and probably, you know, not to kind of admit when you're hurting or when you need help. And so, you know, knowing what I know now, I wish I'd known that back then, and I was able to kind of do more for my dad. And you know, I put that passion, I suppose, into the work I do now in supporting men's health. But it's one of those things that I think is just, it's perpetrated in our culture. And, you know, you see young men who, you know, I feel like things are changing. I see this in our students, and I'm seeing this in my nephews. I think it's really great to see that younger men seem to be a bit more open to talking about their mental health. But it's programs like Mentoring Men where men do have that safe space where they can share those vulnerabilities, or even just be open and have these open conversations. I think that's so powerful. I really like this second quote. You know, real men don't cry. And my answer to that is bullshit. It actually takes strength to cry. Like, that just hits the nail on the head, I think. And that comes back to that idea of really being able to kind of put some of that stigma aside and open up and be very honest about how you're feeling, and not being afraid to show those emotions. And this third quote here, I think, really speaks to that as well. These kinds of programs help men to be vulnerable to their emotions. And if we can teach our kids and the next generation, we're going to have this generation that's better than ours. If we can actually educate people about the importance of reaching out for help and having conversations, and even just, you know, reaching out to other people and sharing your own experiences, that goes such a long way in terms of actually building a culture where people do feel like they can share these things. The magic of mentoring was something that, and I think conversations that we've had along the way, and just hearing about anecdotally just the impact of some of these programs, and I'm sure you've all heard it yourself and experienced this yourself, but it's always such an amazing feeling when you are building a relationship and then it just clicks, right? And this person here mentioned that as a eureka moment for them. And that's the point where you develop that trust and the connection. And you know from there, everything's just going to flow, and everything really takes off. You've got that relationship, you've gotten over that initial hurdle, and now you've got that sense of trust and connection that can really lead to those deeper conversations. And just knowing that you've then got someone that you can turn to if you are in a crisis or if you do need advice, is something that I think a lot of people are missing in our society. And I know that that's, you know, a core function of Mentoring Men, is to give that opportunity to people. And it was really interesting as well hearing about the, the mentor training that all of the mentors had participated in, and even the way that some things were shared in that safe space that was created. And I think that really speaks to the power of the men who actually run those sessions, and the way that they create those spaces. But just even hearing from each other, as mentors, I think that it felt like there were a lot of benefits that were achieved from the mentors themselves, just from hearing other mentors sharing their experiences. So it wasn't just that they were there to share their experience for their mentee to benefit. I think everybody learnt from each other, which is such a beautiful thing. And I think creating that safe space where people do feel like they can share, it takes a lot of work. And sometimes it doesn't click and it doesn't happen, but I think if you can create that space where those relationships are generated and that connection is fostered, that's such an important thing. And this one here also speaks, and you'll see that there's quite a bit of overlap as well with some of these quotes. So some of them talk about, this was such a powerful thing for me through mentoring, but then it also speaks to that idea of having that safe space where they can share stories and experiences. I think that the idea of sort of paying it forward, or, paying it back to their community and putting your hand up to help someone else because you've experienced adversity, or you've been through a challenging time in your life, and you know what it felt like maybe to be quite alone at that time. That's a key motivator for a lot of men who signed up as mentors in the Southwest Sydney region. And that's probably something that many of you can relate to as well. And I think that that's just such an amazing thing, that people are so selfless and so willing to give their time to other men because they know what it can be like, and they know how important it is to have that connection and to have someone that they can speak to. And again, the speaking circle and active listening came up quite a lot as well. And that was something I know that's really emphasized in the training program. But what I really liked as well, and I don't have a direct quote here on the slides, but I do know that there's a real focus as well on making sure that you're able to support other men in their life's journey, but also that you can create that space for yourself where you can practice self-care and you can reflect and you can make sure that you are sort of checking in on yourself and you're okay as well. Because sometimes dealing with, other people's trauma, or not even dealing with it, but just helping them through a situation or hearing about some of the challenges they've gone through can have a huge impact on you as well. So I think that idea of making sure that you're making space for yourself and taking care of yourself as a mentor, it's kind of that idea of putting your own oxygen mask on first before you look after other people, right? Because if you're not looking after yourself, it's really hard for you to then actually take care of other people. And that's such a selfless thing. There was so many strengths to this program that came out of this evaluation. And I wanted to keep it quite brief tonight, just to give some time for some Q&A and a bit of discussion as well. But a couple of the key things that came up, as I mentioned before, I know that there's a very strong focus on making sure that the Mentoring Men program is opened up to men from a lot of diverse backgrounds. I know there's been a very strong focus on that. And Southwestern Sydney in particular is such a culturally diverse area, Western Sydney in general. And I know that we're really excited, hopefully next year our students will be a little bit more engaged, but we're really excited to see how we can try and get our students more engaged in a program like Mentoring Men, because there's just so much power to this. But making sure that the program is accessible to men from different cultural backgrounds. I think even just through the imagery that you're using in your comms and all of your collateral is such an important message as well. So I think that you're doing that really well, and that's really great to see. I think that that's just going to come with time too, as that starts to build. One thing that did come up, and this was pretty consistent across the board, there were a lot of people that sort of spoke about, I love this program, it's so great, but it's just not advertised as widely as it should be. I think people they got so much out of it. And so they were just saying, we need to kind of get this out everywhere in as many eyes as possible, and, get it on radio, get it on the internet, get it out to workplaces. We need to be promoting this because it's such an amazing program. And I think that sometimes that can come down to resourcing and funding as well, which, you know, we need for programs like this to actually be able to work and to be sustained long term. And I think word of mouth as well is such a powerful way of actually getting the word out about, you know, what's being done and the benefits that it can have. But that was another thing that kind of came up. And I did mention before as well, some of the difficulties around actually measuring suicide prevention as a concept, because I think one of the things that's really important to note is there will probably be a lot of men that come into mentoring men and similar programs that aren't necessarily at crisis point. So they may not actually be experiencing suicidal ideations at that particular time, but it may be something that in the future they could reach a crisis point in their life. But actually setting them up with the knowledge and the skills and the networks that they need to get through that, I think is so important. And measuring the impact of that, I think, is where the power is. So we may not necessarily be able to say very clearly, you know, this program has prevented this many, you know, suicide deaths or attempts, but it's the networks and the impact more broadly that this program has on people that I think is such an important thing for us to not forget. And so that's something that you know, we tried very hard to try and capture in the conversations that we had with people as well. So this final quote here, which was from a wonderful program coordinator, was about the mentoring relationship being preventative. You know, it's one of those things that it's there and it's actually giving people those skills and you know, giving them the opportunity to have those conversations in those safe spaces with someone they trust. All of that is going to be preventative in terms of mental health and potentially in terms of suicide risk. So it's really important for us to capture the breadth of the impact of programs like this. I know that Mentoring Men collect quite a lot of data, and that's amazing. And I think that the qualitative data and the stories that can come out of that, I think there's a lot of value in that. And the work that we do, we do always incorporate a qualitative component. People don't really like doing surveys, but we still try, especially because those metrics are the things that funding bodies, particularly government, are very interested in. So even though it's really hard to get people to engage, we still gave it a crack. And we had such amazing support from Mentoring Men from the very beginning. There was such a pleasure. Everyone in the organisation was such a pleasure to work with. And it wasn't through, you know, lack of trying to get people to engage with surveys that we didn't get a huge response rate to that. It was COVID, and it was just people being kind of over doing surveys, and people were just over it, but they were happy to have a conversation because this program actually really encourages that. And so for us, that was such an important part of telling this story, was actually having conversations with people about the impact of this program. So I would definitely say, you know, keep collecting that information and those stories, which I know that you're doing, but that's where, you know, the true impact, I think, really comes out, because there's only so much that a survey can tell you. I think it's when you actually hear people's recollection of what's going on for them, that's where the power is. We also, I mentioned before that we didn't have huge mentee engagement. We had quite a few mentors who were very happy to share their time, and that's probably, you know, the nature of this program. All of the mentors who are here tonight are people who are giving up their time to give back to others, to share their experiences. And so it made sense that mentors were the ones that were willing to put up their hands to do the same for the evaluation. And I know that this is a conversation that's happening internally, but finding out how we can try and get more mentees to engage with evaluation is really important, because I think that's where you'll find out, you know, what they actually need from their mentors as well. And you have those one-on-one conversations and you build that sense of trust, and you would get that out of your mentee one-on-one. But from an organisational perspective, that's a really important voice to be able to capture. As I mentioned before, I know that there's already a lot of work happening behind the scenes to engage men from very diverse backgrounds. And so just continuing that is amazing. And then just enhance awareness of the program. I think getting it out to as many people as possible, pending funds and resources, absolutely. But yeah, that was one of the kind of key things. People were like, I love this and I'm getting so much out of it. And I just wish that everyone knew about it, because everyone could do with having a mentor in their life. And whether that's someone who is a lot more experienced in life, or someone who has gone through something similar, you know, quite recently and is from a similar background, I think there's just so much power in that, and that came through very clearly in the conversations that we had. So that's just a bit of a very high level overview of some of the findings of the evaluation. I'm also more than happy to have a conversation too. So I'll pop my email here, and John, happy for you to share that as well.
You know, being able to get people involved, because it seems that the power is in the experience.
Look, it often is. And I think even the work that we do, as a bit of background, so a lot of the work I do, we've worked with a lot of professional sporting organisations. I do quite a bit of work with the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs, and we ran a men's health program called Active Breed, which was a 12-week program. It looked at physical activity, nutrition, mental health, and respectful relationships. But underpinning all of that was around the importance of having a regular GP and reaching out for support and mental health services and things like that. And what we actually found at the beginning was all of the men that came into the program were all Bulldogs fans. They'd got the email directly from the club, and there was one Manly fan actually. So all of the guys gave that guy a bit of trash talk along the way. But what we actually found the second time around was it was more word of mouth. So we actually had men who either supported a different football club or actually didn't even know the rules of rugby league and were kind of coming along. So when we played touch footy, they'd pass it forward, no idea that they were doing the wrong thing. But it was because they'd heard about other men's experience in the program, or, you know, their partners, you know, someone at work, their husband did it and it was great for them and they'd lost weight and they'd improved their mental health and all of these things. It became that word of mouth. But then likewise, when we're doing work with workplaces, we find that when you have people in the organization who are kind of in leadership roles, who are open to sharing their own experience and vulnerability, that kind of sets up the tone of the culture as well. So I think it's everywhere, right? I feel like it's always about sharing your experience. That's always the most powerful selling tool. If you've got someone who's willing to say, I did this and this was the benefit. It's the same with going to see a psychologist, right? There's this stigma about it for a lot of people, but if your mate or your family member has done it and they talk to you about their experience, it doesn't seem as scary. And so it's something that maybe they'll kind of put their hand up and be like, okay, maybe I'll go along and sort of check this out. So yeah, I do think the experience is such a powerful selling point. It's about kind of capturing that and then being able to, you know, share that story and get people to actually take that step, which is really hard. So yeah, I don't really have a kind of a great answer for how you harness that. But the more you can share that experience, I think the more cut through you'll probably have.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the other things as well that I didn't mention that I should have touched on was across these programs too, there was a very strong sense. It's interesting in men's health. There's often been these silos that people work in where it's quite people are quite insular and quite protective of the work they're doing. And this was something that Simon and I chatted about last week as well. But what we saw with many of the programs that were involved in this grant scheme or funded under this grant scheme was that everyone was so happy to cross promote what everyone else was doing. And I know that you had people from other organizations that did your mentor training, and, you know, Lifeline MacArthur, we're running a suicide prevention training program and we're talking about mentoring men as examples. And, you know, it was just really lovely to see such collaboration, because there's a couple of key things. I think that when there's always this conversation, and it's weird as well being a woman working in men's health, because there are some women who are like, oh, you're betraying the sisterhood by like supporting men's health. It's like, I actually saw this really interesting post on social media where it was saying, you know, if you're supporting women's health, you can still support men's health, and it's not a pie. It's not kind of this infinite, you know, resource of support where if you choose to support one, you're taking away from the other one. I think that the really important thing is that you really have to be looking at supporting both, but also you don't have to pick a side, and you don't have to be so protective over what you're doing to the point where you kind of you're not willing to work with other people. And I think that Mentoring Men are doing an amazing job of being very collaborative and very open to sharing your learnings and what you're doing and this kind of model that you've created that's obviously having such huge impact in the community. So yeah, I feel like there's still probably a little bit of that kind of siloed approach and people still being a little bit protective over what they're doing, but it does feel like that's changing and there is a bit more collaboration happening. And that's a key thing that we want to try and achieve through the Centre for Male Health as well, is starting to bring more people together to work collaboratively to try and tackle this huge issue.
Emma, I think thanks for that. You're absolutely right in terms of what you're saying in terms of that collaboration and that approach where it doesn't have to be men or women, it can be both. Like, like I'm a big believer in, although we're a men's mental health charity, there's no reason why there can't be enough support for both sexes and both genders, and understanding that there are differences between the two genders, but that doesn't mean that we have to pick sides. That doesn't mean that we have to look at, stopping funding for one side to fund the other, or feel like there's an injustice in doing that. Yeah. I think, if you look at the rates of suicide in this country, and then you look at kind of like where the identified help is in terms of where women outstrip men in terms of their help seeking behaviors and that's where you get the stats around why women are, and finds one in four suffer from depression, 1 in 6 from, or 1 in 3 from anxiety. But because men aren't seeking that behavior until it's too late, you're not seeing the other side of it. And I think that's one of the things that I'd love to show that this research and this kind of response can do, is about how we can support men that it is that silent group that we need to cut through. And so that's something that I'm really passionate and looking to do more on. But thank you.
When I'm talking to other people about mentoring men, I feel this sense of discrimination when I'm explaining it's mentoring men. Mm-hmm. And because I'm such a big believer in diversity, I suppose my heightened awareness of the potential for someone to say, well, how come it's just men? I've never had that reaction, but I think from my own point of view, because I just feel that slight sense of, why is it just men? I get it, I know, and I fully embrace it. But I think what I do about that when I'm talking to others, it's hardly ever, if you're talking to a woman, will they see it's inappropriate. They seem to understand that men do find this tough, that it is difficult for them to be vulnerable and to talk about deep issues. So usually if I do feel that a bit, I would just go on and say, well, look, the reason that it is for men is, and then I just talk about the statistics, which is self-explanatory. I think I'm overdoing it a bit. I don't probably need to do that, but I just have that sense perhaps of needing to explain why it is just mentoring men.
Don, again, you are right. And I actually don't think it's the community. I don't think when you talk to women in the community, they actually get it. Like, it's not, this is not something that comes from, from social environments. I think this is driven from a different narrative, and, without getting too political or kind of into other areas of kind of funding and stuff like that. A lot of the women that we work with, and you look at the workforce in mentoring men, we're 50-50, and so there's, I think in the community, people understand it. So I think, we don't have to justify why.
It's the women who come up and engage with me. Sometimes as a husband, male and female, the male hangs back and the woman will come up and takes, I guess it's what you said before, Emma, the male's a bit reluctant, how am I going to look? And it's the women get this in many cases more than the man, and then they'll share stuff with you, and then they've got to go home and talk to their brother or the son or the father or whatever, and that's where the difficulty is. So I think women play such a key role in the progression of mentoring men.
Men's lived experience. So I actually use something which is called lived experience, called phenomenology, which is trying to actually see what's going on for people before they've thought about it. So just that pre-reflective process of what it was like to be in the moment when you were doing this thing called mentoring. And there's stuff in there, and I'm writing another paper too. What seems to be the really interesting thing, and given that we're doing what's effectively called a Rogerian or a humanistic approach, around being non-directive and listening to people. And this happened with the guy who sort of started this process called Carl Rogers, is people develop empathy big time. And that's what the experienced mentors, the really experienced guys really talked about, that they had this unexpected change going on and it was developing empathy. It's like they were becoming a new window in part of the person that they were. And that's really interesting because it, you know, I'm like John, I can go on for ages, but just briefly, I mean, in terms of talking about men and women, so of late, I've been getting really informed by female writers, and my research in this for years was just all men. My supervisors are men, it's mentoring men, it's that's it. So, and I'm getting really informed by mainly female writers around gender, and they're all on top of this. It is amazing. It blows my mind. It's unreal. And they and the really interesting thing is they're talking, and this is what seems to be, this is my latest paper, it seems to be agency. So we can all relate this and say, oh, men, masculinity, men don't show emotions. But you know what? In a way, all that can just be put to the side if you start mentoring, because you become agentic. And being agentic is about your, it's basically confidence. It's like having the self-belief to do something, going and doing it, and then you become efficacious at it. In other words, you get good at it and you start doing it everywhere. And if you're doing it everywhere, you say, I have these hopes for mentoring men that is like this becomes a little crucible and it goes out. Because some of these guys I talk to, they go, yeah, well, I'm at a barbecue and I stop thinking about how I look or what I'm thinking about, and I just get into it with this person. And they're offering that effectively a form of mentoring with everyone. And when we talk about trying to promote it, which I know is a big thing, I love the idea of 360-degree mentoring. I know Ian, and with many of the people here, the relationships I've had over time, I've been there hurt and suffering and being supported. And I like to think I've offered support to other people in that regard at other times. And it's kind of, we're all in it together, which is maybe a bit glib.
Our community speaks over, Simon, what is it, 60 languages?
So I think it's about 52 languages maybe, and
wow.
And maybe close to 30 different ethnic origins and backgrounds. So yeah, it's pretty diverse, and I think what also speaks to this universal language is the socioeconomic areas as well. When you look at kind of like how spread out Sydney is and what that looks like, and then if you look at kind of like where all our mentors and mentees are, there's no, I would say that it's almost like it's universal, and there's no trend that kind of says, okay, well, you know, there's a group of mentors who are in the high net wealth areas, or there's a group of mentees in the low net wealth. It's really mixed, because I think it shows that no matter who you are, no matter what background you come from, no matter, you know, where you come from, you know, in your education and your career, everyone goes through these needs and everyone goes through these issues. And what Mark was saying around that 360 mentoring approach, it's cyclical, you know, like every now, you know, everyone goes through those issues, and everyone goes through times when you feel like you can be a mentor, and everyone goes through those times where you need to be a mentee. And, you know, what we're trying to do here at Mentoring Men is create an environment that it's almost it becomes part of your lifestyle, rather than just kind of reaching out when you need help. You know, it's to create an environment where you are healthy in your mind, healthy in your mental health, you know, and if you create that as part of your day-to-day life, that not only are you doing, like, you know, exercise, or, you know, you're breathing for kind of like to help with your clarity and with your mindset, to actually share your values and share what's going on in your world, and actually just be validated, to let people, or have people say, you know what, you're not the only one. I think that greatly reduces isolation, and greatly reduces issues around you know, being disassociated from the community. So for me, it's paramount, and yeah, it is universal. The more we can share those stories and those experiences, and that comes back to the point you made, Mark, about developing empathy. And, you know, as a mentor, you develop this empathy for people who
maybe, you haven't been in their shoes before, but you're able to connect with them and you're able to kind of give that advice or reflect on your own experiences in some way. And that's one of the most powerful tools to break down stigma as well, is when people feel more empathy and they understand more about other people's situations. That breaks down some of the stigma around mental illness, but it can also help with breaking down some of the stigma around help seeking. And I think coming back to this idea of mentoring being this universal language or this universal approach, I think one of the most powerful things that came out, and just even hearing some of the conversations tonight, was that storytelling, actually sharing those experiences. And if you think about some of the oldest cultures in the world, one of which here in Australia, storytelling is such a crucial part of that. And so I think that just underpins that mentoring relationship. And I would absolutely say that that's a universal thing that, crosses cultural boundaries and age boundaries and geographical boundaries. It's something that can really bring everyone together.
When I was younger, in my early 20s, didn't even know the difference between a counsellor, a psychologist, a social worker, or a psychiatrist. And most people that aren't in the industry, I find, actually don't. But, and I'm mid-40s now, and I found 20 years ago, there was quite a stigma around seeing a psychologist or a counsellor, that possibly for a bloke, but I felt it was regardless of gender. And there was not such stigma with, say, I'm seeing a life coach or I'm seeing a mentor. And the irony of it is that, again, people that know a bit about the industry, life coaches, no offense, but quite an easy qualification versus, say, a psychologist or a social worker. So I'm wondering, how can we work with labels and maybe even come up with a new way of describing, helping profession that reduces stigma?
This is a huge advantage for our mentoring men and mentors. And I agree 100%, Nick. And as a bloke, if you have to go and see a professional, it's almost, for some of it, it's confirmation that there's something wrong with us.
Yeah.
But if I go and talk to Ian, who's an unqualified bum, who's none of those things, and I can just chat to him and he just listens, it's far easier transition. I think it's a huge advantage that our mentors have got, that it doesn't negatively impact the ego of men, and if they again get rejected, the professional thing, it's even worse. Like that, not even they could fix me, sort of thing. I know it's all rubbish, but that's how they would think. So I think it's a position of strength for mentoring men mentors. And most of the issues I'd suggest don't need a professional. They just need someone to listen to them, care for them, support them, encourage them.
The preventative work that organisations like ours does struggle to get a good hearing when it comes to support, particularly of a financial nature.
Yeah, it's really tricky, and I think sometimes it depends on the grant mechanism. Like, we have the same issue with research funding as well. It's incredibly difficult to get funded for research projects. It's very competitive, and there's a very small pool of money, particularly for men's health. As I mentioned before, men's health in Australia is not very well funded, but it's something that we're hoping to change. And I think the louder our voices are and the more we collaborate, the better our chances are at doing that. It's really tricky, and it's one of those things as well. Like, even if you've got a great, we had a range of validated tools, and we took a very evidence-based approach to the way that we designed surveys to roll out. But if people aren't completing them, then you're not going to get that data anyway. And sometimes it's the nature of the questions you're asking as well. Like, in some situations, especially with a program like this, where you may not necessarily have men coming in who are at crisis point, who are experiencing suicidal thoughts, asking them about suicidal thoughts can sometimes be something that is a little bit off-putting, and people don't feel comfortable answering a question about that. So it's a really tricky balance, I think, between asking the questions that governments want data on, and then sometimes, even if you're finding that you don't have people who are at crisis point, they might be saying, well, no, I'm not experiencing that right now. And at the end of the program, no, I'm still not experiencing that. And then you're kind of at that same baseline anyway, so you're not actually seeing that change. So I think it's about being really creative in the way that you capture that data. And even if it's things like, you know, there's the general help seeking questionnaire, where it's about people's likelihood of seeking help from a range of different sources for emotional problems or suicidal thoughts. It's quite long as well, though. So length of tools can be off-putting for people as well. You know, there are single item tools that you can use, but again, it's just the nature of people that engage in these different programs, and you know what they're experiencing at that point in time. It's really hard to actually measure that, and that's where I think the qualitative aspect is important, because it's about people's reflection. And sometimes you can get that across the line, and you can secure some funding on the back of that if you've got someone who really believes in what you're doing, and the impact of that, you know, it tugs on the heartstrings a little bit. But sometimes it's just not, it just doesn't fly. And I guess with such a finite pool of funding, you know, governments are very specific about who they fund and what they fund. And yeah, it's definitely a tricky one. And I think programs like this, there's so much need for them, because as you were saying, Ian, it takes away a lot of that stigma. And you know, even though stigma has probably broken down quite a bit over the years, because people are more willing to have conversations, and kids are learning more about mental health in schools, and hopefully health literacy, we start to see health literacy improving, and people able to navigate the health system and understand the difference between a counsellor and a psychologist. We still have pockets in our society where that health literacy is still quite low, and that stigma is quite high. And so these programs, where it's not actually seeking professional support as such, bridges that very important gap where a lot of people will probably, you know, ordinarily fall through that crack.
Thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to listen in today. And I look forward to speaking and hearing from everyone again in the future.